The Complete Streets movement has transformed New Jersey and the way we think about our streets and communities. The vision for the future is bright.
I think the future of Complete Streets in New Jersey is good. I personally feel that there has been a big shift in thinking, and most likely in the education of those that are entering the field of engineering and planning, and I only see it moving forward.
You know, we're coming out of this global pandemic. We don't really know what the future holds for communities and for travel, but it seems to me that communities that can encourage a walkable environment and also active lifestyles, that's going to be a benefit for everyone.
I think at DOT, Complete Streets is the way of business going forward. I don't think there is a way to go back. I think the pandemic has really shown us that getting out, walking, bicycling, using transit, using the streets for more than just transportation is something that we should be doing. And I think it's just going to get better from here on out.
More and more people are realizing that there's untapped potential in our corridors. And when we complete them, that we open up a whole host of other benefits.
I think the future is that Complete Streets just becomes the norm, and that we are eliminating our injuries and fatalities on the roadway, that we are building strong, resilient communities, resilient in floods, resilient in storms, that we are building communities to help elevate people.
Creating this opportunity through Complete Streets so that parents and children can not only be healthy by walking and biking, but also healthy by creating the social interaction is a really important part of our future.
The evolution is there may be a desire and a need for people-oriented streets. We may have to decide to prioritize pedestrians and cyclists and scooters over single occupancy vehicles.
I think there's 8 counties right now and close to 170 local policies in place, but there's a lot more municipalities, so I'd like to see more adopt policies and then implement them.
It is no longer necessarily viewed as something we're adding on, and I think the biggest challenge we overcome there is from a financing and an investment perspective, because when you view something as an add-on, right, then you also come to the conclusion, well, it's an additional cost. It's not an additional cost. It's part of the cost of building safe, accommodating roadway infrastructure.
When we stop adding improvements to roadways as sort of an afterthought, then we won't have to think about Complete Streets as a project where we're trying to fix a roadway that doesn't accommodate all users. Instead, everything will be complete. And so we won't need special projects anymore. This will be the new way that we do business.
Complete Streets are for everyone. It is the future of New Jersey. For residents, for businesses, for visitors, Complete Streets is a philosophy of making sure we take care of everyone on all our projects, no matter what their ability or their comfort level is. We take care of people, that's the civil side, of civil engineering, and we'll know we're doing something right.
Welcome, everyone. Good morning. My name is Dan LiSanti, and I am the manager of NJDOT's Bureau of Safety, Bicycle, and Pedestrian Programs. The Bureau is part of NJDOT's Planning Division. The Bureau is the home of the Office of Bicycle and Pedestrian Planning and the Office of Complete Streets Implementation, which include a variety of bicycle and pedestrian planning and program activities, along with the Complete Streets Initiative and SME support to the Safe Routes to School program. In addition, the Bureau is responsible for the management of the Federal Highway Safety Improvement Program and provides safety subject matter expertise on a wide variety of analysis, programs, projects, and initiatives. I oversee a team that reviews capital projects to ensure that it complies with the department's Complete Streets policy. We also analyze crash data, conduct pedestrian road safety audits, and create problem statements to get solutions implemented. We provide Complete Streets training within DOT and to partners across New Jersey. It's no exaggeration to say that Complete Streets is part of my Bureau's everyday operations. Before we get started, please note that this session is being recorded. And after the summit, the recordings of this and all the other sessions will be made available online. This is the second panel session today, titled Connecting to the Future: What's in Store for Complete Streets in the Next 10 Years. In this session, you will hear from panelists about some of the forces that will shape the future of complete streets, including climate change, pandemic recovery, micromobility, EV technology, and zero deaths initiatives. I hope you enjoyed this session and join us for the rest of our sessions today. And with that said, I'll now turn it over to our moderator, Lauren Rushing.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for being here today, and thank you, Dan, for that introduction. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lauren Rushing. I'm the Communications and Community Engagement Manager at the New Jersey Bike and Walk Coalition, and I'll be your moderator for this session. I'm honored to be introducing an impressive group of panelists who will share their insights on what's in store for complete streets over the next decade. First, we'll hear from Olivia Glenn, the Deputy Commissioner for Environmental Justice and Equity at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, who will provide her insights on the importance of complete streets, social justice, and climate change. We also have Dr. Bob Noland, who is the director of the Voorhees Transportation Center and a professor at the Edward J. Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. And he'll be sharing some interesting research he's conducted in New Jersey on public opinion and behavioral responses to changes made to walking and biking during the pandemic. Then we'll have Barkha Patel, Deputy City Manager for the City of Jersey City, who will talk about the city's Vision Zero action plan and making temporary COVID response bike lanes permanent. Finally, we'll hear from Michael Manzella, the Director of Transportation and Deputy City Manager for the City of Asbury Park, who will talk about the launch of the Jersey Shore's first bike and scooter share programs and the relationship between EV infrastructure and bike ped improvements. The New Jersey Bike and Walk Coalition recognizes that complete streets are an essential part of creating safer and more convenient ways to bike and walk in New Jersey. As a statewide advocacy organization, NJBWC was involved in developing the Complete and Green Streets for All model policy and guide, and works with local municipalities and advocates to bring complete streets to their own towns. Over the last year and a half, as all of us have watched New Jersey municipalities adopt a complete and green streets approach or accelerate projects in response to COVID-19, we've all seen a heightened demand for safe transportation for people on foot, on bicycles, or using other wheeled devices. As we begin to recover from the pandemic, we are at a pivotal point to keep up the momentum for reimagining our streets as inclusive, safe places for people. What's in store for implementing complete and green streets in the future? How can we reduce serious injuries or fatalities among our vulnerable road users? What technologies are on the horizon that will impact complete streets? How do complete and green streets help advance other goals like reducing climate change? These are all questions that we must be asking in order to take a strategic approach to the future of transportation and avoid returning completely to the old normal. So, the purpose of this session today is to address some of these questions and to start the conversation as we build back better. Just a bit of housekeeping before we get started. After presentations from each of our panelists, we'll come back for an audience Q&A. Please note, though, that the chat box has been disabled for this session, so we encourage you to ask questions using only the Q&A box. To our panelists, if you see any questions you'd like to answer, feel free to respond yourself in the Q&A box, or if it's something you'd like to answer live, then you can vote that question up in the Q&A, and we'll get to it later. So with that, I'm going to kick it over to our first speaker, Miss Olivia Glenn. The floor is yours, Olivia.
Good morning. Are you able to see me?
We are able to see you, yes.
Okay, wonderful. Good morning. My name is Olivia Glenn, the Deputy Commissioner for Environmental Justice and Equity at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. And I am delighted to be here to offer some reflections on the future of complete streets, looking ahead the next 10 years. I think that this is a pretty exciting, you can go back one slide, please. I think that this is a pretty exciting, relevant, and pioneering conversation for us to have in New Jersey as the nation's most population-dense state. And from an equity perspective, we are the nation's fourth most diverse state. I believe that complete streets truly sit at the nexus of transportation and environmental priorities in many ways. And I'll touch on a few of them today. Go to the next slide, please. So in summary, I think that there are three things for us to consider for the future of complete streets where there is a nexus between transportation and the environment. First, I believe the future of complete streets is more equitable, inclusive, and just, not just for the form of modality, but also the communities that will be impacted, connected, and prioritized. Second, I believe there will be more coordinated approaches across levels of government and sectors, ranging from the nonprofit sector to the private sector, along with government agencies. And finally, I also believe that complete streets will be a more mainstreamed priority within climate change considerations, rather than just an esoteric consideration. The next slide, please. So honing in a little bit on being more equitable, inclusive, and just, if we briefly look back, I know the last panel did, and I just want to take a brief moment to look back at the creation of the interstate highway system. It simultaneously brought us together, but it also created sustained pockets of bifurcation and isolation, most notably in our poorest communities and communities of color, the same communities that have large numbers of carless households and experience the highest exposures to inhaled pollution from mobile transportation sources. Looking ahead, as we build complete streets projects, we have the opportunity to restore, recalibrate, and in some cases to build what has never been there before. And in the words of President Biden, also to build back better. As we expand complete streets that serve all, we will only increase our connectedness to each other. This will result in advancing justice, equity, and inclusion all at the same time. New Jersey is well poised for this. Looking ahead the next 10 years, our state can be a learning lab for the nation of connecting urban, suburban, and rural communities, as well as our wealthiest communities with the poorest through a complete streets network. Next slide, please. So I think opportunities abound in looking ahead at something just like a simple map like this that shows us where there are municipalities and counties that have complete street policies, and juxtapose that with the next slide, something like our new environmental justice mapping tool that we have at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. So this mapping tool was just developed this year as a product of the environmental justice law. And what this tool does is it shows the areas that are the target of the environmental justice law. And namely, it's the block groups across our state where the communities are at least 35% low income, 40% minority, or 40% limited English proficient. A block group only needs to meet one of those three priorities. And with the color coding you'll see there are some municipalities that meet 1, 2, or all three priorities. And so in total, this reaches 331 of New Jersey's municipalities that have overburdened communities within our borders. So it certainly helps us prioritize where we think we could further some complete street networks. Candace Perry, who was our Director of Environmental Justice here at DEP, will give a presentation that will more specifically focus on our environmental justice priorities in a session later today. So make sure you don't miss that. Next slide, please. Looking ahead, complete streets will grow across multiple levels and sectors. We will see more projects where we are celebrating the interconnectedness between adjacent communities. And it's beneficial not only for transportation planners to consider it, but from individuals, schools, the corporate sector, park planners, and trail planners. They will see the value added in putting their resources and thoughts together for the continued benefit and coordinated, concerted benefits of their communities. While there is certainly an economy of scale with building complete streets, the benefits can also be very hyper-localized. Within one's own community, rethinking the way that one travels to the grocery store, drops off their kid to school, recreates in the evening, enjoys dinner at a local restaurant, and even more. The reasons and opportunities abound to advance complete streets across multiple sectors. I know that some of the panelists who follow me today will touch on examples in municipalities around the state. The next slide, please. For us, specifically at the Department of Environmental Protection, within the next 10 years, I see a vital tool that we will bring to this conversation is an update of the New Jersey State Trails Plan that was last updated in 2009. And just last month, New Jersey held its first ever Greenway and Trail Summit, a collaborative effort between the DEP and the Department of Transportation with a number of partners. There is no doubt that closing some of the trail connections won't be off-road segments. It will require coordination with on-road alignments that need complete street configurations. I think of some of the key corridors of the East Coast Greenway and the circuit trails as just two examples that will require complete street segments to close critical trail gaps. Next slide, please. One of the deliverables that we're going to provide at DEP, along with a suite of other partners, is the development of a statewide trail geodatabase. And so we have an excerpt from the 2009 Trails Plan that describes the need for this. And this is the quote: "Complete, convenient, and accessible trails information is essential to guide the public in using trails and decision makers in assessing facility needs and priorities. This visionary style plan also talks about how a comprehensive trails inventory would provide the public with readily available information about the location, type, length, accessibility, and uses associated with each trail and complete street segment." You can visit our website to learn more about the New Jersey Trails Plan as it exists, and we look forward to having you as a part of our process as we develop it moving forward. Go to the next slide, please. And so the opportunities abound across the state. And so within each of the 3 metropolitan planning areas, you can see some of the trail networks that are already planned. And certainly we will need complete streets to close some of the gaps within some of these, just as examples. And for us, with the state and our partners, this data is being compiled as we speak, and we expect to finish it shortly. And that data should be released between now and the end of the year. So please continue to stay tuned. The next slide, please. So finally, within looking at ways that we'll see growth in 10 years, I think that complete streets will be mainstreamed within climate change priorities. Temperature and sea levels are rising faster in New Jersey than in most of the country, and even in some instances, the world. New Jersey is susceptible because we are highly developed and a coastal state with 50% of our population in at-risk areas. The effects of climate change present real threats to our economy and our way of life, as well as to our environment and public health. New Jersey has a suite of initiatives underway to address climate change. I will highlight just a few. The next slide, please. So here you will see a number of reports that you can find on our website, one of which is the Scientific Report on Climate Change, which is a comprehensive effort to synthesize the latest and most reliable scientific information on the current and predicted future impacts of climate change. We'll be adding more chapters in the future, including one on health impacts and the economy, because we know that both are being impacted by climate change now. In addition, we have the New Jersey Energy Master Plan, the most recent, and New Jersey's Global Warming Response Act, or what we call the 80 by 50 report, which is our effort to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 80% in 50 years. So with that, we spell out what some of the priorities are, and you can feel free to peruse that report on our website. Finally, we have a climate change resilience strategy that was developed by an interagency council on climate resilience. This document identifies priorities and strategies to proactively plan and prepare for the climate impacts that New Jersey cannot avoid, some of which is happening now. Priority 1 is to build resilient and healthy communities is particularly germane to today's discussion. To address climate and all we are doing at DEP, we are working to embrace nature as a tool to help us mitigate some of those effects. And there's no doubt when we look at how we can design complete streets, also having green features is deeply important. The next slide, please. And just making an even stronger nexus to why this is important. This is from the 80 by 50 report, where we can see in New Jersey, transportation, mostly due to mobile sources, it contributes to 42% of our greenhouse gas emissions. So the opportunities abound, not just to look at electric vehicles, but also look at ways we can get people out of cars altogether on complete streets to further our efforts. The next slide, please. So in looking at the building of healthy communities, there's no doubt that complete streets are a critical part of that network. Next slide, please. So I want to thank everyone for their time. I look forward to answering any questions that anyone may have, and I am going to pass the floor over to Dr. Noland from the Voorhees Transportation Center. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Olivia. I'm ready to start. Okay, I'm going to talk about a study that we did, and we're still working on it, where we're looking at reactions to some of the street closures that have occurred, and in particular, some of the outdoor dining that has been set up. And I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Evan Yakabuchi, who's a former PhD student, and Wenwen Zhang, an assistant professor in the Blaustein School. Next slide, please. Okay, so we all know that during the pandemic, just anecdotally, I'm sure most of you noticed that there was an increase in local walking activity, especially during the initial lockdown periods and such, mainly for recreation, to get out of the house and such. And in response to this, a lot of people, a lot of cities throughout the country, throughout the world even, started closing off streets to accommodate walking, cycling, and then ultimately outdoor dining as restaurants began to reopen. So some of the key questions that we're looking at is, have people increased their active travel as a result of these street changes? And more importantly, do people like them? Do they approve or disapprove of these street changes? And do people want to see these made permanent in the future? Next slide, please. So just a couple of slides of photos. Jersey City. Next one, please. The one on the left is Witherspoon Street. The one on the left is George Street in New Brunswick, which is still closed off like 3 blocks for outdoor dining. Witherspoon Street in Princeton, which from what I understand is going to be made permanent in the near future. With some, more aesthetic than the concrete blocks, I believe. Next slide. Okay, so what did we do? So we did a survey, statewide survey of New Jersey residents using an online panel using Qualtrics, which is a company that maintains the panel. It's a representative sample based on age, gender, income, and race. And we collected the data between November 30th of last year up to February 25th. It was about an 18-minute survey. Somewhat lengthy, which is why it took a while to collect our sample, which was 1,419 respondents. Next slide. Okay, so what did we find? So one key question was to find out at least the perceptions of what our respondents saw out there. So has your area made arrangements for outdoor dining? 85% said yes. Dining of that amount, dining set up on sidewalks was 60%, parking spots converted to dining 70%, and some streets closed to traffic 33%. So that's just the perceptions of people throughout the state as to what the changes were. Next slide, please. Public support for allocating space for outdoor dining. And so we had various questions from a strongly agree to strongly disagree range here. And I'm going to focus mainly on the agree and the neutral being people who are in the middle. They didn't really have an opinion on this. And as you can see here, some streets remain closed to support outdoor dining after the pandemic. 40% agree with that, strongly agree or just agree with that statement, and the disagree is in the minority. So we see 40% agree, 30% don't really care one way or another. So our disagreeers are a much smaller minority here. And what surprised me, the graphic on the right, is some parking spots should remain dedicated to supporting outdoor dining. Usually the last thing people want to see go away is parking, right? So I was surprised actually that the agreement on that was a little bit higher, 47%, and less disagreement on that. Next slide, please. So looking at the perceptions that people had as to what had happened, we had a question about accommodations made in my area for safer walking and cycling. So the blue bars is yes, no. The red is no accommodations made. Actually, the yellow is don't know. That's omitted from this graph. Sorry about that. The key thing here is those who reported yes, that accommodations had been made, 55% agree that some streets should remain closed for outdoor dining. And 30% who were familiar with it, or I'm sorry, 34% who had not seen anything still agreed with that. But you see on the disagree side there, if they're not exposed to it, they tend to have less agreement generally. Next slide. So what did people think about the impacts on their town centers? And this is kind of a measure to look more closely at what they liked about it or disliked about it. And 45% here agreed that outdoor dining has made their area more interesting and lively. And 38% agreed that it brought more people to the town center. And just notice the small amount of disagreement on the response to this question. Next slide, please. Negative views tend to be in the minority here. Now, usually you hear the major argument here for not doing this is it's going to cause congestion in the area. And only 31% of our sample agreed that it caused traffic congestion on other streets. 36% disagreed, 34% had no opinion on that. And the other one that I've heard about is, and that we asked, was since restaurants and businesses have taken over sidewalk space, it has become difficult to walk in places. And a slight plurality there agreed with that statement, but the difference is here with the disagree is not that much. And again, we have our neutral there in the middle. Next slide. So how did walking behavior change? Or at least how did people report whether or not it changed? And we find that about 46% said they walked more frequently for pleasure than they did before the pandemic. 31% disagreed with that statement. And on distance walked, again, 38% said they walked longer distances, and 36% disagreed with that. Okay, go ahead, next one, that's fine. This was the response says, has your area made arrangements for safer walking or cycling? And only about 29% said yes to this, and the majority here actually said no. Next slide. Now, the interventions that people saw did increase walking. And so here we have the blue being, yes, accommodations made in my area for safer walking and cycling. And 69% of people who saw that in the area said they walked more for pleasure. Okay, whereas on the disagree, it's more people said no accommodations had been made. So this seems to indicate that doing these interventions seems to increase the amount of walking behavior. Next slide, please. Now, we hear a lot about people saying, well, everything's going to change after COVID. I don't think we're yet after COVID. So we asked a question for before and during, and walking behavior both before and during COVID. And this is looking at the frequency of walking, going from never walking to 5 or more days a week. And if we look on the left, I don't really see much change here between the frequency of walking. In fact, we see a slight decrease in the 5 or more days a week, and perhaps that represents, people working at home more and not walking while they're at work or something. So it's unclear what's happening there. On the right, we have for bicycle use before and during COVID, and notice that over 50% never biked, and we don't see too much change in the frequency of bicycling in the other columns there in the change. Next one, please. So we did a little bit more in-depth analysis here. I'm not going to go into what the models were about, but we basically looked at 2 questions. Outdoor dining arrangements have made the area more interesting and lively. Some streets remain closed to support outdoor dining after the pandemic. We thought, well, maybe there's some demographic associations here in the data in terms of people's perception. And we didn't really find any, maybe a little bit with age for these 2 questions, but it wasn't really a consistent pattern. We did find that people who like the outdoor dining and want to see the streets closed tended to eat out more frequently and have also experienced eating outside during COVID. And those that were more fearful of getting ill were also more supportive of these changes. Next slide, please. We also asked about reported walking frequency. These 2 questions, I walk more frequently for pleasure than I did before the pandemic, and I walk more frequently to accomplish a task than I did before the pandemic. A few minor demographic differences with these, usually those older than 65 and Hispanic individuals identifying as Hispanic tended to walk more for pleasure and for tasks. Those not working as well also did, but no difference for those working at home, for those working out of the home. We thought there might be some differences there. But the active travel measures in an area, so again, this link between having seeing the changes in your area tended to increase walking, as well did as fear of getting ill from COVID. Okay. So our key takeaway here, and I'm almost done. I see questions there. All things equal, respondents walk about the same during our survey period than before the pandemic started. But there was some increase in recreational utilitarian walking. And so, the change in walking may be the type of walking done. There is an association between street changes, support active travel, and self-reported walking. And there's a sizable association between street changes, support active travel, and public support for continued street closures and outdoor dining, which is really one of our key conclusions here. And I think that's my last slide. I'll just mention we're doing a lot more. We had a lot of, we're looking at working at home, we're looking at transit recovery, online shopping, and we're gonna, we hope to implement another survey in the next month or so, and then another one in 2022. And I think that's my last slide. Thanks.
And next up, we have Barkha Patel with the City of Jersey City.
Thank you, Lauren. Hi, everyone. My name is Barkha Patel. I'm the Deputy City Manager for the City of Jersey City and formerly the Director of Transportation Planning. Today, I'll be talking about Jersey City's work on the Vision Zero initiative and the build-out of our protected bike lane network. I wanted to start, though, with just this collection of photos and scenes from Jersey City to reinforce that the guiding principle behind all of the work that I'll be talking about today is to encourage the safe and comfortable and joyful use of our streets by people of all ages and abilities. And I will start by talking about the Vision Zero initiative. So Vision Zero starts with the ethical belief that everyone has the right to move safely in their communities, and that the system designers and policymakers share the responsibility to ensure safe systems for travel. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with the Vision Zero initiative already. This is a map, which may be a little outdated by now, of all of the cities in the country who have committed to Vision Zero. Next slide. In Jersey City, in 2018, we became the first city in the state of New Jersey to commit to Vision Zero. And what led to that was really a strong advocacy from residents, really vocal championship from our leadership, and specifically Mayor Fulop, and the willingness of staff and everyone at the staff level in the city to commit to this really revolutionary and progressive goal, which is a new way of doing business for transportation planning and traffic engineering within a city. So in Jersey City, we established a goal of reducing severe injuries, fatalities and severe injuries that result from traffic crashes to zero by the year 2026. And in an effort to achieve that goal by the year 2026, we engaged in an 8-month-long process to create an action plan, which is our Vision Zero action plan. And that started, first of all, with an inventory of all crashes that had occurred in Jersey City over a 10-year period. So from 2008 to 2017. And the result of that analysis is what you see on the screen here today. So in an average year, over that 10-year period in Jersey City traffic crashes, 20 people were involved in serious injuries, and 9 traffic crashes resulted in fatalities. And the goal is to reduce both of those numbers to zero, again, by the year 2026. And the data here are actually really interesting. You can see in the column under city roads, for example, that while pedestrians make up only 6% of all crashes on city roads, they make up 57% of fatalities. And so we saw from this data that pedestrians and cyclists, who are our vulnerable users, are being disproportionately impacted by traffic crashes, and that became the focus of the rest of the action plan. Next slide. And so once we had the data, we wanted to verify and validate that with the community and make sure that what we were seeing in the numbers accurately reflected what people were experiencing in their daily lives and the use of their streets in Jersey City. And so over the course of 7 to 8 months, we had a number of outreach events, more than we've had for any other transportation plan that we've developed, which included 13 or so community events, online surveys, social media, many engagements. And as a result of that, we were able to get a better understanding of what the most frequently noted concerns are of the community and how those match up to data-proven contributing factors to those crashes. Next slide. And all of that work helped us develop a high injury network for Jersey City, which is a collection of streets where a lot of the traffic crashes are happening. So on the map on the left, you see the orange lines on a map of Jersey City, and that is what our high injury network is. So that is a small percentage of our streets, 14% of our road miles, where a majority of our severe and fatal crashes are occurring. In this case, 55% of all crashes and 61% of all fatal crashes on just city streets are occurring only on 14% of our roadway miles. And then we had a separate high injury network that incorporated county and state roadways that go through Jersey City, which are also some of the more high injury roadways. In addition to that, we mapped out communities of concern and overlaid that with where the crashes were happening, because we wanted to be able to prioritize investments, not only on the high injury network, but in communities of concern and in communities that are most severely impacted by traffic crashes. In Jersey City, however, after going through this exercise, almost all of the city was covered and identified as a community of concern because of concentrations of minority, low-income populations, carless households, female head of households. And so While that effort didn't help us further prioritize our work, it did help us understand, who is living in which communities and how they are specifically impacted by crashes. Next slide. So this entire effort led to the most critical piece of the action plan, which is the list of actions and strategies that the city is committing to in order to achieve its Vision Zero goal by the year 2026. So we came up with a total of 77 actions and strategies, and they're broken up into 5 different themes, which are designing safer streets, promoting a culture of safety, embedding Vision Zero in citywide practices, enforcement, law, and policy, and planning and leveraging data. So this is an example of what the action plan looked like. Every action was tied to a responsible agency out of our Vision Zero task force, which includes 18 members of different city agencies, as well as the county, the state, and Hoboken, our neighboring city. It's also tied to a time frame and very specific performance measures. Next slide. So that action plan was completed in February of 2019, and since then we've engaged in all of the work that we outlined in that action plan and have since released an annual report for transparency and to report back both to ourselves and the public on the work that's been done and how successful that's been. Next slide. So here's a chart showing historically the fatal crash data in Jersey City, both on all roads, so city, county, and state, as well as breaking it out just by city roadways. And you can see that in the last 2 years, since we committed to Vision Zero, 2019 and 2020, the numbers haven't necessarily significantly decreased. But what has happened is that we've continued to invest significantly in the work that we believe will get us to achieve that goal by the year 2026. Next slide. And so that includes over that 1 year between 2019 and 2020, the installation of hundreds of speed humps, of several miles of protected bike lanes, signal timing changes, pedestrian safety improvements, placemaking efforts, all around the city. And you can see the dots on that map there to represent the location where all of these interventions have taken place. And perhaps the most visible of those has been our protected bike lanes, which you can see in the photos, the before and after of Washington Boulevard on the right there. So next I'm going to jump into the protected bike lanes, which started through the development of our bicycle master plan, which was also completed in September 2019 and coincided with the development of our Vision Zero action plan. So when we started developing the bike master plan back in 2018, this is what the network looked like. We had about 36 miles of conventional, unprotected bike lanes throughout the city. You can see them as the red lines overlaid on top of our street network on the map there. Next slide. And when we take away the street network, you can see what it really felt like to bike in Jersey City. You can see the fragmented network, completely disjointed, and if this were the street network for vehicular travel, it would be completely unacceptable. And what that felt like and looked like on our streets is, several cyclist fatalities and injuries happening on a regular basis, and cyclists just being pushed to the margins of our streets and historically of our planning process when we were designing and looking at streets. Next slide. So keeping all of that in mind, we went through a year-long community outreach process, and maybe our most robust outreach process that we've gone through so far to develop this bike master plan. And we're going to go pretty quickly through the next few slides as I talk about that. So we started with handlebar surveys where we rode the streets with residents, elected officials, police officers to take stock of the infrastructure that was in place. Along the route, we would stop and discuss what we were noticing, experiencing, feeling, and how we can improve it. After that, we started working on, sorry about the photo there, we started working on a demonstration project where we wanted to build a pop-up bike lane on one of those streets that we rode to get a better understanding of what the infrastructure could actually look like and feel like on our streets. And so we went and installed a pop-up bike lane for the period of 3 days over a holiday weekend, just to test it out and prove to the community that this infrastructure could actually work, and got great usage out of it. And so here's a before photo of the street where we implemented the pop-up bike lane, 2 travel lanes in each direction, parking lane on both sides of the street. And here's what it was transformed to using really low cost materials. And this was our first protected bike lane on our street in Jersey City as a pop-up. And that created the momentum for us to go ahead and start implementing more pilot and permanent bike lanes throughout the city. Here's an example of the pop-up becoming a permanent bike lane. And when we started out with this process, it consisted mostly of taking infrastructure that was already in place. You can see the old conventional bike lane that was on the street here, away from the curb, with the parking lane along the curb that was hatched out. And then in the next slide, you'll see how we just shifted that over and reallocated the street space to implement a protected bike lane along the curb. Here's another example of that, where the bike lane is buffered with a line of delineators and has an extra level of protection with a floating parking lane, just by reallocating the street space there. And our project started to get bigger and bigger. This is our longest length of bike lane that we have in Jersey City, which is about a mile in each direction. And it also incorporates a lot of pedestrian safety elements, bus islands, etc. You can go to the next slide. This is a photo of a 2-way cycle track, which is what a majority of our bike lanes look like, because we're trying to balance parking needs, limited street space on our streets, and the fact that we want to commit to better and higher quality bike and ped infrastructure. And as the projects continued, we started to explore more substantial barrier elements. So you can see here the installation of Jersey barriers as a protection on one of our bike lanes that previously had delineators. And here's just an example of our planning and design team going out for a ride with the community to test out the infrastructure with the Jersey barriers in place and the 2-way cycle track. And in addition to that, as we look to make a lot of this infrastructure more permanent, we're also investing in purchasing equipment for the maintenance and protection of those bike lanes. So these are smaller street sweepers that are specifically bought for our bike lane, so that they fit within the narrower lanes in the city. And we also have snow removal equipment specifically for our bike infrastructure. In the next slide, you can see a photo of people riding in the snow, which people definitely do, contrary to popular belief. And finally, coming full circle, this infrastructure is really installed so that it can support people of all ages and abilities. And this has taken on a role of its own, and it has become such an institution in Jersey City that now many of our other city agencies are planning events like a kids bike ride, choose your own adventure, kids bike ride, to take advantage of the infrastructure. And the fact that our youngest citizens in the city feel comfortable riding in the bike lanes and using the infrastructure is a vote of confidence that they're designed well, they're comfortable, and they're inclusive of anyone and everyone who wants to use this. All right, so that's my last slide, and I'll hand it over to my friend Mike Manzella from Asbury Park.
Thanks, Barkha. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Mike Manzella. I'm the Deputy City Manager and Director of Transportation for the City of Asbury Park. Also, would like to give a quick shout out to our Transportation Manager, James Bonanno. He's on the call as well, for all of his efforts to help make all that we've accomplished in Asbury Park possible. Next slide. Thanks to the support of our Mayor and Council, and with the assistance of advocates in the community, such as the Asbury Park Complete Streets Coalition, we've done a lot of great work in Asbury Park and have made significant progress over the past 5 or so years in implementing our Complete Streets policy and supporting more active transportation and micromobility. We adopted, previous slide, sorry. We adopted our Bicycle and Pedestrian Master Plan in 2019 with the assistance of New Jersey DOT. Since then, we have striped nearly 10 miles of bicycle facilities in our city of only 1 square mile. And we've made significant progress in terms of education and awareness for the benefits of complete streets. And a lot of that is also thanks to our Asbury Park Complete Streets Coalition, among other nonprofit organizations in our city. The picture that's shown on the screen is of what's called See Here Now. It's a major music festival, music, art, and surf festival that started in Asbury Park in 2019. And you can see from the picture that this festival is just a highlight of how much of a priority that bicycle active transportation has become in our city. And there were over 20,000 attendees to this festival, and thousands of them took bicycles to the event. So we developed some goals in order to promote micromobility as the next step for Asbury Park. We saw that there was a need to further reduce traffic congestion and dependency on automobiles, to encourage the use of public transit, and definitely to expand low-cost access to transportation for our communities that are underserved by public transit, that are of historically lower income and car-less households. So with those goals in mind, we launched the Jersey Shore's first bike share program in the summer of 2017 with 50 bikes, and that service was provided by a company called Zagster. But we found that the bike share program was somewhat limited in its ability to meet the goals that we just talked about before, and we wanted to further expand access to micromobility to reach more communities as much as possible. Next slide. So in August of 2019, we launched the first scooter share program on the Jersey Shore, and it was at the time the second such program in New Jersey. It was intended to be a one-year pilot program, and the vendor that was selected was Spin Scooters, which was actually operated by Zagster, our former bike share provider. We had some great results over the first few months of our scooter share program. We learned a lot about the issues involved with executing such a program. Some of the lessons learned we were able to make as the program was rolled out, the pilot program. So we capped scooter speeds to 12 miles an hour, and that helped to assure pedestrians that, obviously scooters were encouraged not to ride on the sidewalk, but if they did end up on a sidewalk, it was at least at a little bit of a slower speed that made pedestrians a little more comfortable. We also ended riding after 9 p.m. And we had a pretty robust age verification system in place to make sure that our riders were 18 and over. Unfortunately, the pandemic hit, as everyone knows, in March of 2020, and the scooters were pulled off the street by the vendor, as at the time we weren't sure how the virus was spreading and whether contact surfaces might be a potential method of spread. So at that time, unfortunately, our bike share provider went out of business, and we were not able to bring back the scooters. Next slide. However, we persisted and issued another RFP and relaunched our scooter share program just this past Memorial Day. And this service is now provided by Super Pedestrian, and the service is called Link. Link was selected for its focus on technology and the onboard technology that was available, and for the Super Pedestrian's focus on safety primarily. The scooters have onboard sensors that monitor over 140 safety critical events. They have an onboard control center for a very rapid response time when it comes to geofencing, which basically tells scooter riders where they can and cannot ride. Next slide. When we launched the program, we have more than 50 virtual parking hubs, and that really helps to keep the program organized and efficient. We spread these parking hubs throughout the city, so you're never more than just a few short blocks from where you are to any scooter parking virtual hub. We also painted those locations on the street in order to provide further clarity to the riders as to where they should be parking those scooters. Those parking locations are primarily off-street in the no parking zones, but also where there's available room on the sidewalk or in our parks. Next slide. With this go around of the scooters, we really have taken a higher focus on community engagement and education and awareness of how scooters should be riding safely. And our vendor, Super Pedestrian, has been really helpful in that outreach process. They've held nearly a dozen outreach events where they distribute safety information and provide learning lessons for riders to learn how to ride safely. Next slide. Our vendor and the city has done extensive partnership with community organizations such as Second Life Bikes, shown here, and our Complete Streets Coalition, among other nonprofits who do community development work, to really get the word out to the community that this is a viable option for transportation and to really focus on how to ride safely. Next slide. There's also been a strong presence at community events such as this one. This is National Night Out, where our police are heavily involved, and we have a huge community turnout. Again, the vendor was able to be there providing safety information and letting people know about the program. Next slide. We've also started an ambassador program, which has really helped to, kind of assuage the public in terms of those who are not maybe using the best behavior when riding scooters. So we've actually utilized our existing crossing guards and develop, help them, train them with the help of Link and Super Pedestrian on how to promote safe riding. And they've also sort of helped with enforcement to make sure, if they see a rider riding on a sidewalk or riding in the wrong direction of traffic, to kind of intervene as best they can and say, look, this is how you should be riding safely. And it's been pretty successful in kind of further selling the benefits of having this scooter program. Next slide. Super Pedestrian has a program called Link Up, which provides over a 70% discount to qualifying riders who are on some kind of social services program or can prove lower income. The vendor has done a lot of outreach, and as is the city, in partnership with our community nonprofits, to get residents to sign up for the program. We have over 50 active users in just a few short months, and we are definitely looking to increase that number as much as we can. Next slide. So I'll get into some of the data that we've experienced for our scooter program on the second go around. The average daily trips per vehicle is 5.5 since our relaunch, since Memorial Day of this year, which is a huge number. A lot of the scooter vendors will say that if they can deploy in cities and get over 1 trip per scooter per day, that's good. So we are in a very good place. And the next few stats kind of highlight that the scooters aren't really being used just for joyriding or kind of the recreational trips, which some people are definitely exploring our city using scooters, but they really are a necessary means for people to get around our city. So the median trip duration is only 7.2 minutes. 63% of our trips are 10 minutes or less. The median trip distance is less than a mile, so it really solves that last mile issue to transit. And over 57% of trips are less than a mile. So again, it's used as a utilitarian mean of transportation and not just a recreational mean. Next slide. This slide shows the number of trips and the trip utilization over the duration of both of our scooter programs. Obviously, you can see in the middle, COVID-19 kind of put a lull in our micromobility program in Asbury Park. But we found that after the pandemic, with this second go round with our scooter program, that the trips are higher and the utilization is higher. And I think that goes a lot to some of what Bob talked about earlier in terms of more people using active transportation. And, in a way, unfortunately, less people are using public transit because of the safety issues regarding COVID-19. And more people are looking to either bike or use scooters, which is great. Next slide. So if we were to go back to our first slide that showed the See Here Now, that has been our most popular day for micromobility, both with our pilot program in 2019 and just this year when the festival came back after the pandemic. You will see that the trips were actually more this year and a much higher utilization on our most active day of micromobility. Next slide. We also have engaged with ride report to provide some data information about how our program is reaching all areas of the community and just general statistics of its use. So this map shows the city of Asbury Park and its streets and the number of trips per day on average for the scooter program. So the darker purple numbers are upwards of 100 trips per day, and some of the lighter pink numbers are 1 to 3 trips per day. And you can see from the map that, you know, we really do see ridership happening in all parts of the community. And what this also allows us to do is help us to understand where to focus infrastructure improvements, because we certainly want to prioritize, you know, infrastructure improvements in those areas where the most rides are happening. But we also want to, you know, try to understand why rides aren't happening in certain other streets, right? And is there infrastructure that we can improve to prioritize, you know, to increase the number of ridership in those areas? So the next slide. One of our other focuses, of course, is equity. And we like to try and monitor how many trips are coming from all segments of our community. The lower left corner there is our historically lower income majority minority population. And we are going to continue to look to grow that, that amount of ridership as much as we can. I will stop there as I'm quickly running out of time and pass it back to Lauren to wrap up.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. And thank you to all of our panelists. Wonderful presentations. We're now just going to spend a few minutes answering questions. So we did have some questions that came in during the pre-registration. So I'll be pulling a little bit from those, and then we'll also take some questions from our live audience. And I've seen that the Q&A box has been very active. So thank you, everyone. Okay, so let's see here. The first thing I'd like to discuss is one thing that we often hear from towns and advocates is that local municipalities who adopt complete streets or Vision Zero policies then experience difficulties in kind of knowing where to start with implementing projects. So what advice would you give to local governments or advocates who are stuck at that point? Is there anything in your experience that's been helpful in going from, okay, awesome, now we have a policy, to now what? And I think maybe either Michael or Barkha could start us out with this question.
Sure. I think, you know, for communities that maybe are struggling with trying to figure out where to take the first step, I think the best thing they could do really is reach out to other municipalities. I know that there are advocates and, you know, other town officials or elected officials who have, you know, started the process and would be more than happy to share kind of our success stories, what challenges to look out for. I think that is a really helpful way of understanding where to start.
Great, thank you, Michael.
In Jersey City, one thing that really helped is our commitment to tactical urbanism as an approach just for engagement, not even as a way to, you know, impose any infrastructure in the community, but to test it out as a way to start a conversation. In most instances, that has led to the infrastructure actually becoming permanent, which is a great byproduct. But our approach was always to use that as a way to engage with community as opposed to just showing them plans. And we always had the advocates work with us as volunteers to implement the infrastructure. And so that gave them ownership over the work that we were doing and helped them helped build momentum on their end as advocates for the city, which ultimately supports us as staff for the city.
Right, thank you, Barkha. Olivia or Bob, did you want to weigh in on this question at all? Okay, so then the next thing I'd like to ask about is, so we saw some of the interesting findings from Bob's research. And one thing that kind of stuck out to me was that some of the respondents had answered that since restaurants and businesses had taken over some sidewalk space, it had become difficult to walk in some places. And then Michael's presentation also touched on safety for scooter users with respect to where they're riding. So this kind of begs the question, as we move forward with implementing more complete streets projects, what strategies can we be doing to reduce these conflicts between cyclists, pedestrians, business owners, as well as all these other emerging micromobility devices, and to avoid that perception that these different types of active transportation are in competition with one another for street space.
Go ahead, Mike.
No, go ahead, Bobby.
No, I don't have a clear answer to that question, but probably at least to some extent, just providing more space for all these activities would probably be the easiest solution. Less space for cars.
Yeah. That was sort of going to be my response. I think thoughtful design that really prioritizes those most vulnerable users are going to be the best way to avoid those conflicts, right? I also think, maybe some of the respondents in the survey were thinking about expanding outdoor dining on the sidewalk and not necessarily in the street. I think probably the best way to improve that is to just open the street to pedestrians, right? I mean, if we can do that, there's more than enough space to accommodate both the outdoor dining and the and people walking, pedestrians. And then also with the scooters and that question about micromobility, I think, the vendors out there are really focused on safety, and there's a lot of technology that they're developing that will serve to mitigate this problem. I know our vendor is working on a technology called Pedestrian Defense, whereby they'll be able to detect whether a scooter rider is actually on the sidewalk, and it will be able to bring them to a slow stop and instruct them to go back to the street. So there's a lot of, I think technology can really help with those kind of conflicts. And then of course, just education.
Right, yeah, education. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Bob.
I was just going to add that, some people with disabilities in a wheelchair or who are blind might have difficulties with just throwing stuff out there. So those considerations need to be taken into account.
Great, thank you. And Barkha, did you want to weigh in at all on this question? Have you had any experience with that in Jersey City as you've implemented a lot of your projects?
Yeah, we were very deliberate about that, specifically when we started some of these new programs at the beginning of the pandemic. We had certain minimum standards to ensure that there wouldn't be conflict specifically with pedestrians and people wanting to use the sidewalks. And then anything that happened, like Mike was saying, was using the parking lane or street space. And we saw that because our local business community, had an interest in that, and we were really trying to support them, it all of a sudden opened up an option that wasn't open ever before of being able to use a parking lane on a commercial corridor. And the success of that program in Jersey City has now opened people's minds to think of the street space as more flexible than it was previously. So I think that's really the solution.
Great, thank you everyone so much. Really thoughtful insights. We're going to move next to a design question. Hopefully someone here could answer this. We had an anonymous attendee who asks, or who says that there's a new bike lane leading to Mercer County Park in her area, or his or her area, and they're happy to see it. However, many drivers are using the new bike lane as a right turn lane only. Have there been any successes on communicating this to drivers or dealing with this issue? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know the details of this specific bike lane, but I will say that that's a major area of concern and design focus that has to be part of these projects, is really the intersections, right? I mean, I think that, there's a lot of different engineering approaches to solve problems. And I think as those of us who work for municipalities or those elected officials out there have to really push their engineering teams to look at the approach that prioritizes the most vulnerable.
Right, yeah, that was going to be my thought as well, that continuing that bike lane through the intersection, I think, can do a lot for solving that issue. While you're off mute, Mike, we do have a quick question directed at you. Daniel wonders how many scooters are in your fleet. The 5.5 trips per vehicle number is incredible, he says.
Oh, thanks, Dan. We have 250 scooters. That's the max that we cap our vendor to allow to put on the street. Obviously, during the winter season, that number is going to come down because the ridership just won't be as high, but we can go up to 250.
Great, thank you. I want to switch gears here just a little bit and talk more about community engagement for Complete Streets projects. So one of the questions that we had in the pre-registration is, what are the best practices for ensuring all community members feel like Complete Streets projects will benefit them? And how can we prevent improvements such as bike lanes from contributing to gentrification and community disruption? So there were a few of our panelists, Michael, Barkha, and then maybe Olivia, you'd also want to weigh in on this, that you guys had mentioned a little bit about your community engagement processes. Do you want to speak to this point? Maybe Olivia, we could start with you.
There we go. Okay, yeah, a few thoughts. One, in terms of just the gentrification conversation, I think that is largely dependent on policy makers, planners, and elected and appointed officials to kind of mitigate that. I think those concerns are only really valid if that's actually what's intended by the project. If it's known that it's going to raise some property values, I think there's some ways to just like mitigate and buffer some of those impacts, but it does take intentionality on a part of a community's leadership to make sure that doesn't happen. But I don't think that that should be an overwhelming concern or a barrier to moving forward any of these initiatives. And then what was the first part of the question, if you can remind me?
How can we ensure that all community members feel like Complete Streets projects will benefit them?
Yes, I think that also lies in the hands of those same leaders to think about the messaging. And one of the things that we're really working on at the DEP right now is really being intentional about who our audiences are for particular projects. To help shape that for us, I think we need to look down like at the block group level as it's relevant, or municipal level, a county level, depending on the level, to look at who comprises the community. What is the actual percentage of carless households? What percentage of residents are limited English proficient? And are you reaching the community with the appropriate languages to bring them into the conversation at all? Sometimes we say we don't hear from those sectors, but it's because we haven't reached them at all. And so we need to make sure that our efforts are reaching them in very relevant data-driven ways. So I think that planning ahead and then using that to focus and target how we engage should help us move forward.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I know that's something that we at NJBWC have been thinking a lot about over the last year with one of our projects, the Essex Hudson Greenway, how to meet people where they are and engage those communities that are not usually a part of the conversation. Michael or Barkha, did you have anything to add to that question? Were there any specific techniques that you used in reaching out to communities of color, for example, in your process for the Vision Zero plan or for any projects in Asbury Park?
Yes, absolutely, for our Vision Zero plan and our bike master plan. I mean, I think Olivia articulated it perfectly, and she's a leader in the space, and that's it. Everything that she described is exactly what we've experienced in Jersey City, and the few tactics that we've used are one, to have lots of different types and levels of engagement. So in our Vision Zero plan, we started with online surveys, and we thought it would be a great idea for people to plot points on a map and say, here's where we've seen a traffic issue, or here's where we feel unsafe. And when we looked at where the responses were coming from, and we did like a heat map, all of downtown was lit up, and we had, thousands of responses, which would have been great for any other study, but we noticed that they were just coming from one neighborhood. And so for the entire rest of the planning process, all of our outreach was in-person events, farmers markets, going to places of worship, and meeting people in person and asking the same questions, but just gleaning the information in a different way, and also providing different levels of engagement. So for the people who are, young professionals who don't have time to go to a meeting but can fill out a survey online, there's that option. For the people who prefer face-to-face interaction with city staff, that was an option. So that really helped. And then the second thing was for us, and we continue learning this lesson, is to be really, really flexible when we're going out to the community. We may think that what we want to implement is a bike lane project or a plaza project, and we may hear back that what's really needed is that our sidewalks aren't wide enough. And so that's the thing that needs to be the priority, and we often have to shift course and be really, really nimble and flexible on the spot. And our city leadership has given us the opportunity to do that. I know that's not available everywhere, but it helps when the staff has that level of flexibility to respond to concerns in real time.
Right. Thank you so much, Barkha.
Let
Olivia?
me just add something. Yes, I think that what Barkha said was just really so deeply profound. I think one of the lessons that all of us as planners should just learn is about that importance of being nimble and seeing that people in a community offer a level of expertise that we do not have. We have the technical skills, but we do not always have the hyper-localized data that ground truths what the final outcome should be. So it's really important for us not to be so deeply committed to our concepts that on the ground, they can become tone deaf. So deeply valuable, I think that is.
Right. Thank you, Olivia. Okay, so with that, I'm sorry to say it, but we are unfortunately out of time for today. So thank you to our audience for all of your questions, and a big thank you to all of our excellent panelists. We had some great presentations today and a great discussion. So I look forward to staying in touch with everyone and continuing this discussion through our work and through our advocacy. Before we end, just one last reminder that all the sessions are recorded and will be available post-summit on the New Jersey Bicycle and Pedestrian Resource Center YouTube channel. And if we didn't have time to get to your question today, please see the handout on the session page on the Summit website for information about how to follow up directly with the panelists. So thank you so much, everyone, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the summit and have a great weekend.